Okay, so this is going to be my walkthrough on how I proceeded to basically from sketch, thumbnail drawing to final painting, create this, what I call the Kasia Dream and Fly digital painting. As you can see, I like working in Procreate, which is an app that's available on the Apple iOS. And, as such, I'm using it on my Apple iPad Pro. The iPad Pro itself is a few years old at this point. I think it's a 2018. But anyway, at any rate, it still works great. The pencil is, I think, the second generation Apple Pencil, and it works great as well. Starting out with the drawing phase, as you can see, I like to use a lot of photo reference in general when I'm creating a painting. As it is here, I'm starting into the penciling phase. It's penciling, right? But I mean, it's all digital, but I mean, it looks like a pencil, but the intent is that it's a rough sketch that I'm developing as I work on the painting, to basically get it to look as the way I envision it. Part of what I also like to do is use models, as in this art, I think it's called Art Pose, and this is the female mannequin here that's available. And I use this from time to time. I've used it in both to use it as a way to trace, but in this case, I'm actually going to draw, using it as a true reference side by side. Part of the importance of that, I feel, is that it helps with my drawing and keeps my eyes and my hands connected, so to speak, in terms of drawing. I'm working here on what's called the flying pose here for Kasia. And again, I'm referencing right here my own online comic book, and using a reference to look at how her costume is drawn. And here I'm using my hands. Again, I like to use photos, so I photograph my hands, use it as a reference. Now moving on to the stage where I'm going to basically throw in a bunch of flat colors, relatively simple shapes, almost silhouettes, but they are the base colors that I will eventually go on to paint or render over on top of. So this phase is a lot like when I color my comic books, just kind of a color flatting style. And I do all this using a variety of, brushes, but also selections with the selection tool. Here, after I've done those color flats, I then go over the figure, those base flat colors, using some shadows and some highlights, and dropping in some darker values to basically start creating some contrast. And then, continue so on and so forth through both characters here. It's the same character, but there's a pose where she's sleeping in bed and one where she's flying. I will, after I've laid down those values of light and dark, I then start doing a rough kind of blend or smudge, as it's called, the smudge tool in Procreate, where I'm going to start shaping and kind of filling out where I want to show volume and transition between, the light areas and the dark areas of the figure that I'm working on here. And what I've done is, obviously I didn't do this all in one sitting. This is a total of over 13 hours working on this digital painting here. So I've broken it up, and I think this is probably the third or fourth day where I'm going in and I'm now starting to add a little more details to the background, or in this case, it's really the foreground, because it's the bed sheet or the blanket that Kasia is using to cover herself. So, I'm just going through, doing some smudging, starting to again define and kind of create the forms, using the light and dark. And a lot of this is just kind of like that initial first pass over to see where I'm going to start blending the edges for, the different light and dark patterns that are in the painting. Once I've done the light and dark, I almost go into like this phase of, utilizing the smudge tool. And I'm using the I think it's called the Nico Rule brush, which I tend to like the quality that has, because it imparts a slight kind of grainy or rough texture to the artwork, which is just a look that I enjoy in my own work when I'm creating and painting, so to speak, digitally. Here you can see that I'm putting in more darker tones, darker values throughout. And again, that's going to help to create the illusion of depth also provide contrast throughout the painting. Nothing too exciting about working on those pillows, but on the other hand, they're necessary to create or illustrate or kind of paint the picture, if you will, of where is this particular character, what are they doing. Obviously she's asleep. We would assume she's asleep, but in my digital painting here, I'm creating it to where essentially she's dreaming and she sees herself dreaming. She's transformed into this character that, the character is Kasia, but she's also a meta-Terran in my realm ethereal universe of characters that I've created. And working in this particular phase where she's in the flying mode, the dream mode, I'm, really much more free with how I'm expressing this certain openness that she has, almost like she can't be contained. So, the bands that you see in her, the gold that you see in there, they do represent something, which is something that will be revealed in the story. But for right now in this illustration, as we see it, as a render in different parts of, in this case, like her feet and her flesh tones, for the most part, it's just kind of a visual to separate the two, the dream state between the dream state and her real awake state, I guess we'll call that. Moving on to her hair in the dream state, I tend to keep it a little more ambiguous, maybe not quite as detail rendered as you saw on the portion of the painting where she's asleep. So that was really fun to do, just to kind of give it more of just like mass and a little bit of shade with some highlights. Actually worked quite a bit on the hair to kind of give it that almost spontaneous look. Moving under her costume here, you see I'm starting to I sharpen up the flat areas of color, those gold bands, and I'm adding some shading to it. And there's a scarf kind of element to her costume that I actually missed from the beginning. And I realized about maybe 3/4 away that I need to render that back in. So that's what you're seeing there. So I'm playing kind of catch up. The brush that I'm using for most of the rendering has been a pencil tool. And it kind of, has this grainy type of appearance to it, which I just really enjoy. The other brush I'm using, as you can see here in the background as I paint in the clouds, is a round brush, but it's also not the default smooth or hard brush. It also has a bit of a texture, which again, I really like texture in my, the brush strokes, or at least when I start laying down the flat colors. For the stars, I'm using a star brush. And I'm pretty sure I imported that from somewhere. It might be a default brush in Procreate. I'm not sure. I'll have to check that and see where I got that brush. It's really convenient for doing stars. Now I'm using the pencil brush again here just to add a little bit of highlights to some of those clouds in the background. That background really is, for me, more of an indicative state of her being in this dream world. And obviously she's flying through space, or maybe it's just through the air and it's dark with just some really cool purplish looking clouds. Regarding the purple, you'll notice that's a pretty consistent theme with or I should say consistent color palette that I'm using on that right side of the painting. Here I'm actually going back because I did not finish her fingers or her fingernails. So what I'm doing is I'm actually tightening up some of the edges on the fingers, and you can see right here I'm drawing in her fingernails because she has fingernails. If I wanted to make sure that it is realistic to the point to where everything is represented accurately. Using the pencil tool, using different shades of the base value, which is, if you notice on the sleeping side, it's going to be a darker low-key value, and it'll probably be somewhat warm, but I just want to push it back so that it looks darker. It may not look like that in the video because I think the lighting on the camera itself is taking in more, but you'll see in the end that there's more contrast between the final image. Here what I'm doing is I'm using it's like a flat brush where I'm creating these kind of like these waves, or not waves, these lines, these horizontal lines that indicate like a transition between her dream state the sleeping state and the dream state. So I just thought it was a really cool graphic. a really cool way to kind of also show movement of the figure, to kind of to draw the viewer's eyes into where the focus is, which is basically her dream state. And so, as I'm tidying things up here toward the end, I'm adding up some backgrounds, details, because I'm trying to convey that she's obviously in her room asleep. Maybe there's a bit of a sci-fi element to the portion of the background, so we see some lights, and as I continue to finish up the illustration here, I just kind of bounce back and forth, kind of tidying up little areas here and there. It's mostly in the background area because now I really just want to make sure all facets have been taken care of, so that there's a complete picture of Kezia sleeping, dreaming, and then in her dream state flying and soaring. So that's kind of a quick walkthrough of how I created the Kezia Sleep and Dream painting.